Hey everyone. Tonight we're stepping into the ancient shadows of the Old Republic to uncover one of the most chilling and brutal tales in all of Star Wars lore. The story of Darth Malgus, a Sith Lord whose name became synonymous with absolute ruthlessness, whose very presence could shatter the will of entire armies before a single lightsaber was ignited. This isn't just another tale of a fallen Jedi or corrupted apprentice. This is the chronicle of a being who weaponized brutality itself, who turned psychological warfare into an art form so terrifying that even other Sith Lords whispered his name with a mixture of respect and fear. So before we begin this dark journey together, take a moment to hit that like button if you're ready for tonight's exploration into the depths of Sith brutality. And don't forget to subscribe if you enjoy these deep dives into the most forbidden corners of the galaxy far, far away. Drop a comment and let me know what part of the world you're listening from. I love seeing our global community come together for these stories, especially when we venture into the darker chapters of Star Wars history. Now, get comfortable. Maybe dim those lights, settle into your favorite spot, and prepare yourself for a tale that will reveal truths about power, fear, and the price of absolute strength that were buried in the deepest vaults of Sith archives for good reason. Picture this moment, lost to history, but recorded in the encrypted holocrons of the Sith Empire. The year is 3,641 years before the Battle of Yavin, on the war-torn world of Alderaan. Not the peaceful planet Princess Leia would one day call home, but a battlefield where the very ground trembles beneath the weight of Republic and Imperial forces locked in desperate combat. The air crackles with lightsaber energy and blaster fire, but suddenly, an unnatural silence falls across the battlefield like a shroud of death itself. Through the smoke and chaos emerges a figure clad in ancient Sith armor, his crimson lightsaber casting an ominous glow across the scarred landscape. But this is not the entrance of just another Sith warrior. You see, Malgus had not simply killed this Jedi Master. In the hours before this moment, he had done something so methodically cruel, so psychologically devastating, that it would become the template for a new kind of warfare. He had captured the Jedi's Padawan, a young Twi'lek girl barely 16 years old, and while the Master watched helplessly, Malgus had slowly, deliberately, explained in perfect detail how he would corrupt everything the girl had ever believed in, how he would turn her into the very thing she had sworn to fight against. But here's what the Republic soldiers couldn't have known. As they stared in horror at that severed head, the girl wasn't dead. She stood behind Malgus now, her eyes yellow with Sith corruption, her small hand resting on the lightsaber that had just killed her own master. The Jedi hadn't died from the blade that took his head. He had died from the moment he realized that his student, his spiritual daughter, had willingly chosen to embrace the darkness after Malgus had shown her what he called the liberating truth of power. But what created such a monster? What twisted a being capable of love? For yes, Malgus had once loved deeply and truly, into something that could orchestrate such precise cruelty. Tonight we'll uncover the hidden archives that reveal the truth behind the legend. We'll discover the secret weakness that drove him to such extremes of strength, the fear that made him more dangerous than any other Sith of his era, and the ultimate price he paid for becoming the most brutally effective weapon the Empire had ever wielded. In the deepest vaults beneath the Sith Academy on Korriban, where the red sands have absorbed the blood of countless dark rituals, there exists a chamber that even the most ambitious Sith apprentices dare not enter without invitation. The walls are carved from blackened stone that seems to drink in light itself, and ancient Sith runes pulse with a malevolent energy that whispers of forbidden knowledge. This is the archive of shadowed truths, where the Empire's most dangerous secrets are kept locked away from those too weak to comprehend their power. You find yourself standing at the threshold of this chamber, not as a Sith Lord or ambitious apprentice, but as something far more dangerous to the established order. You are a seeker of truth, one who has dedicated their life to understanding the real history behind the legends that shape the galaxy. Your companion on this perilous journey is Darth Vexus, a Sith historian whose pale skin bears the intricate tattoos of ancient Sith script, each mark representing a century of study into the Empire's most classified records. Her yellow eyes hold the wisdom of someone who has stared into the abyss of Sith brutality and emerged with her sanity intact, though perhaps not entirely unchanged. The air in the archive chamber is thick with the weight of millennia, each breath carrying the metallic taste of old blood, and the ozone scent of Force lightning that has scorched these walls countless times. Holocron pedestals rise from the floor like silent sentinels, their surfaces covered in dust that hasn't been disturbed for decades. But one pedestal stands apart from the others, its surface clean and gleaming despite the abandonment that surrounds it. Upon it rests a holocron, unlike any other, its crystalline structure pulsing with a deep crimson light that seems to beat like a heart. Vexus approaches the holocron with the reverence one might show a sleeping krayt dragon. Her voice, when she speaks, carries the hushed tones of someone who knows they are about to disturb something that was meant to remain buried. This is the personal archive of Darth Malgus himself, she explains, her fingers hovering just above the crimson crystal. It was sealed by his own hand before his final campaign, filled with records he deemed too dangerous even for his own successors to possess. The Emperor's hand tried to access it once. They found his body 3 days later, aged 50 years in as many minutes, his mind completely shattered. The holocron responds to her touch with a sound like grinding stone, and suddenly the chamber fills with the ghostly blue light of a holographic projection. But this is not the familiar figure of Darth Malgus, as history remembers him, not the imposing Sith Lord in his distinctive armor. Instead, you see a young human male, perhaps 20 years old, his face unmarked by the scars that would later define him. His eyes, though already touched by the yellow corruption of the dark side, still hold something that would be completely absent in his later years: vulnerability. If you are viewing this recording, the young Malgus speaks, his voice lacking the mechanical rasp that would come from the respirator he would later require. Then I am likely dead, and you have somehow bypassed the defenses I placed around these memories. Know that what you are about to witness is not the legend of Darth Malgus, but the truth of what created him. I record this not out of vanity or pride, but as a warning to those who might follow the same path I have chosen. The projection shifts, and suddenly you are witnessing scenes from Malgus's youth on the industrial world of Drum Kas. The young Sith moves through the corridors of the Sith Academy with a purpose that sets him apart from his peers. Where other apprentices swagger with false confidence or cower in genuine fear, Malgus displays something far more dangerous: calculation. Even as a student, he was already studying his fellow apprentices not as rivals to be defeated, but as specimens to be understood and ultimately controlled. Vexus pauses the recording, her expression troubled. "This is why the archive was sealed," she says quietly. "It wasn't Malgus's victories that terrified the Emperor's court, or even his methods. It was this: the systematic way he approached brutality, as if cruelty were just another subject to be mastered like lightsaber combat or force manipulation." The ancient stones around you seem to pulse with dark energy as she reactivates the holocron. Now you see Malgus in his first true test, a ritual combat against a fellow apprentice in the depths of a Sith tomb. But what unfolds is not the passionate duel of young warriors testing their strength. Instead, you witness something far more chilling. Malgus methodically dismantles his opponent not just physically, but psychologically. He speaks throughout the combat, his words carefully chosen to exploit every fear, every doubt, every insecurity his enemy has ever harbored. By the time Malgus delivers the killing blow, his opponent is already broken in spirit, begging not for mercy, but for understanding of why his own mind has turned against him. Malgus grants neither, but in the moment after the death, when he believes himself unobserved, the projection reveals something that would change everything you thought you knew about the legendary Sith Lord. His hands are shaking. The young Malgus steps away from the corpse and removes his training mask, revealing a face streaked with tears he cannot control. For just a moment, the calculated facade crumbles, and you see the truth that he has hidden from the galaxy for his entire career. He is not a monster by nature. He is a being who has chosen to become monstrous, and that choice terrifies him more than any enemy ever could. The holocron flickers, and you catch a glimpse of what appears to be a much older recording, showing Malgus in his prime, standing over what might be the most horrific scene of his entire career. But before you can process what you're seeing, the image cuts out, leaving you in darkness with only the sound of your own heartbeat and a growing understanding that you have only begun to scratch the surface of the truth behind the legend. The holocron's crimson glow intensifies as Vexus manipulates the ancient controls, her tattooed fingers dancing across symbols that predate the Galactic Republic itself. The chamber around you seems to respond to her actions, the carved Sith runes along the walls pulsing in rhythm with the device. What emerges from the crystal matrix is not another holographic recording, but something far more immersive. The very air begins to shimmer, and suddenly you find yourself standing not in the archive chamber, but in the corridors of the Sith Academy as it existed over 3 millennia ago. The transition is seamless, as if you have stepped through time itself. The stones beneath your feet are no longer worn smooth by ages of neglect, but sharp and freshly carved. The air carries the sounds of distant lightsaber training, and the screams of apprentices being tested beyond their limits. This is the Academy in its prime, when the Sith Empire was ascending and young warriors competed for the attention of masters who could grant them power beyond imagination or death beyond redemption. Through these corridors walks the young Malgus, now perhaps 25 years old, his body already bearing the first scars that would eventually cover him entirely. But it is not his physical appearance that draws your attention. It is the way other apprentices react to his presence. They do not challenge him as they would a normal rival. They do not ignore him as they might a perceived weakling. Instead, they watch him with the wary attention one reserves for a predator that has not yet decided whether you are prey. You follow his path through corridors lined with the trophies of ancient Sith conquests. Jedi lightsabers hang in display cases like butterflies pinned to boards, while preserved specimens of creatures from across the galaxy serve as reminders of the Empire's reach. Malgus moves through this museum of conquered worlds with the confidence of someone who already sees himself as the next addition to its collection of legends. His destination becomes clear as he approaches the chambers of his master, Darth Vindican. The older Sith Lord is a figure of terrible beauty, his pale skin marked with the ritual scarification that denotes his rank within the hierarchy. But there is something in Vindican's eyes as he regards his apprentice, a mixture of pride and growing unease that suggests he has begun to suspect what his student is becoming. "You requested this audience, my apprentice," Vindican says, his voice carrying the formal cadence of Sith protocol. "The Academy whispers of your latest victory in the trials. They say you defeated 3 opponents simultaneously without once igniting your lightsaber." Malgus inclines his head respectfully, but there is something predatory in the gesture. "I have learned much from your teachings, Master. You showed me that true power lies not in the strength of one's blade, but in understanding the weaknesses that exist within all beings. Even the strongest warrior becomes helpless when his own mind turns against him." What follows is a conversation that reveals the true scope of Malgus's ambition. He speaks of his fellow apprentices not as individuals but as case studies in psychological manipulation. He has catalogued their fears, their desires, their breaking points with the systematic thoroughness of a scholar. More disturbing still, he has begun to test these theories in small ways, pushing his peers toward actions that serve his purposes while believing they are following their own desires. Vindican listens with growing alarm as his apprentice describes techniques that go far beyond the traditional Sith teachings of domination through strength. Malgus has developed methods of control that work not through force, power, or physical intimidation, but through a deep understanding of how minds can be turned against themselves. He speaks of planting suggestions so subtle that his targets never realize they are being manipulated, of creating situations where others will destroy themselves while believing they are acting out of free will. There is wisdom in understanding one's enemies, Vindican says carefully. But what you describe sounds dangerously close to the techniques of the ancient Sith sorcerers. Those arts were abandoned for good reason, my apprentice. They corrupt not only the target, but the wielder. Malgus's response reveals the philosophical foundation that will drive all his future actions. Corruption implies a departure from one's true nature, Master. But what if cruelty and manipulation are simply tools like a lightsaber or force lightning? What if the only corruption lies in refusing to use every weapon available to achieve victory? The scene shifts around you, and suddenly you are witnessing Malgus's first true test of his theories. In the Academy's combat chambers, he faces not one opponent but an entire group of apprentices who have banded together to eliminate what they perceive as a growing threat. The odds are overwhelming, 6 against 1, and each of his opponents is skilled enough to be dangerous in their own right. But Malgus does not draw his lightsaber. Instead, he begins to speak. Standing among the bodies of his fallen peers, Malgus finally draws his lightsaber, but only to salute his watching master with the weapon's crimson blade. The message is clear. He has moved beyond the crude methods of his predecessors, where other Sith rely on anger and hatred to fuel their power. He has learned to weaponize the deepest fears and insecurities that exist within all sentient beings. But in that moment of triumph, as Vexus allows the vision to fade back to the present archive chamber, you catch a glimpse of something that chills you more than all the brutality you have witnessed. In Malgus's eyes, there is no satisfaction, no joy in victory. There is only a growing emptiness, as if each successful manipulation takes something away from his own humanity. The quest to understand this legendary Sith Lord has truly begun. And already you sense that the truth behind his brutality may be more tragic than any legend ever suggested. The ancient holocron pulses with renewed energy, promising revelations that will challenge everything you thought you knew about the nature of power and the price of absolute strength. The holocron's ancient mechanisms whir to life with a sound like distant thunder, and the chamber fills with new projections that transport you deeper into the mystery of Darth Malgus. This time, you find yourself not in the familiar corridors of the Sith Academy, but in a place that few living beings have ever seen, the private study of Malgus during his rise to power within the Empire's hierarchy. The room is austere in a way that surprises you. Where other Sith Lords might surround themselves with trophies of conquest or displays of wealth, Malgus has created something that resembles a scholar's laboratory more than a warrior's sanctum. The walls are lined with datapads containing psychological profiles, behavioral analyses, and detailed studies of every culture the Empire has encountered. Maps of the galaxy cover entire sections of the chamber, but these are not tactical displays, showing military positions. Instead, they are marked with notes about population centers, cultural weak points, and the specific fears that dominate different species. At the center of this clinical workspace sits Malgus himself, but this version of the legendary Sith Lord appears different from the imposing figure of later years. His armor is simpler, his scars fewer, and most tellingly, his breathing is still natural and unassisted. He works with the focused intensity of someone engaged in research that consumes his entire being, cross-referencing data from dozens of sources to build what appears to be a comprehensive guide to psychological warfare. Vexis moves closer to examine the documents spread across his workspace, her expression growing increasingly troubled as she reads. These are not military reports, she whispers, her voice barely audible in the oppressive atmosphere of the memory. They are case studies. He is documenting every instance where he has successfully broken an opponent's will, analyzing the techniques used, and the time frames required for complete psychological collapse. The level of detail is staggering. Malgus has recorded not just the methods he employed, but the precise moments when each target's resistance began to crumble. He has noted environmental factors, the target's personal history, their relationships with others, and even seemingly minor details like their preferred foods or childhood fears. What emerges is a portrait of someone who has turned the destruction of hope itself into a science. One particular document draws your attention. A detailed analysis titled The Corellian Senator, a Study in Progressive Demoralization. The report describes how Malgus spent 6 months systematically destroying the life of a Republic politician who had opposed imperial expansion. But rather than simply assassinating the man, Malgus had orchestrated a campaign that slowly stripped away everything the senator valued. His political allies were turned against him through carefully planted evidence of corruption. His family was driven away by orchestrated scandals that seemed to originate from his own poor choices. His reputation was destroyed through a series of public humiliations that appeared to be the natural consequences of his own actions. The senator never knew he was under attack. As far as he could tell, his life was simply falling apart through a series of unfortunate coincidences and personal failures. By the time Malgus finally revealed his role in the destruction, the man was already broken beyond repair. The final meeting between them lasted only minutes, just long enough for the senator to understand the scope of what had been done to him before taking his own life in despair. But what makes this document truly chilling is not the brutality of the campaign itself, but the clinical detachment with which Malgus analyzes its effectiveness. He notes which techniques produced the fastest results, which psychological pressure points proved most vulnerable, and how the time frame might be shortened in future operations. There is no hatred in his observations, no personal animosity toward the victim. The senator's destruction was simply an experiment in applied psychology, valuable only for the data it provided. The projection shifts, and you witness Malgus implementing these refined techniques on a larger scale. During the Empire's campaign against the Republic world of Ord Mantell, traditional military doctrine would have called for a direct assault on the planet's defenses. Instead, Malgus employs methods that make conventional warfare seem almost merciful by comparison. The genius of his approach becomes clear as you watch the psychological assault unfold. Each piece of false information is crafted to exploit existing tensions within the Republic forces. Old rivalries between military units are inflamed into open hostility. Cultural differences between species are magnified into insurmountable prejudices. Personal grudges between officers are transformed into accusations of treason. By the time Malgus finally launches his physical attack on Ord Mantell, the planet's defenses have already collapsed from within. Republic forces are so busy fighting each other that they barely notice the Imperial fleet's arrival. What should have been a costly siege becomes little more than a cleanup operation, with Malgus walking through the conquered cities like a scientist observing the results of a successful experiment. But it is in the aftermath of this victory that you glimpse something that challenges everything you thought you understood about Darth Malgus. Instead, you see something that might be the most disturbing revelation yet. Malgus appears to derive no pleasure from his victories. The psychological destruction he has wrought seems to affect him no more than a successful mathematical calculation might affect a computer. He has become so detached from the emotional impact of his actions that brutality has become simply another tool, no different from a lightsaber or starship. Vexis pauses the recording, her face pale in the holocron's crimson glow. "This is what the other Sith Lords feared," she says quietly. "Not his power, not his tactical genius, but this complete disconnection from the emotional consequences of his actions. They understood that a Sith who feels nothing, who has no passion left to corrupt, might be the most dangerous being in the galaxy." The ancient chamber around you seems to grow colder as the implications of this revelation settle in your mind. You are beginning to understand that the legend of Darth Malgus may be far more complex and terrifying than any story of simple evil could convey. At the head of the table stands Malgus, now bearing more of the scars and cybernetic enhancements that would define his later appearance. His breathing apparatus, though not yet the full respirator of legend, gives his voice a slight mechanical edge that adds weight to every word he speaks. "The Republic believes they have identified our pattern," Malgus announces, his scarred hand gesturing toward the holographic display. "Their intelligence services have analyzed our previous campaigns and concluded that we employ psychological warfare as a preliminary to conventional assault. They have prepared countermeasures, tighter communication security, loyalty verification protocols, psychological conditioning for their troops." A murmur of concern ripples through the assembled officers. Admiral Heradax, a grizzled veteran of dozens of campaigns, leans forward with obvious worry. "My lord, if they have learned to counter our methods, perhaps we should return to more traditional approaches. A direct assault with sufficient force can still achieve victory." The suggestion hangs in the air like the scent of ozone before a lightning strike. Malgus turns his attention to the Admiral, with the kind of measured consideration that other Sith might reserve for contemplating the beauty of a sunset. But there is something else in his expression, a flicker of what might be disappointment, as if he had hoped his subordinates would understand the deeper implications of the situation without explanation. "Traditional approaches," Malgus repeats, his mechanically enhanced voice carrying a note of something that might be amusement if it came from anyone else. "Admiral Heradax, you have served the Empire with distinction for 3 decades. In your experience, what happens when an enemy successfully adapts to counter a particular strategy?" The Admiral straightens, sensing he is being tested. "Standard doctrine suggests developing alternative tactics, my lord. If one approach fails, we implement contingency plans." Malgus nods slowly, but his attention has already shifted to the holographic displays surrounding them. With subtle gestures, he manipulates the projections to show detailed analyses of Republic defensive preparations on the world of Alderaan, their next target. The data reveals exactly what he described: enhanced security protocols, psychological conditioning programs for troops, and communication systems designed to prevent the kind of infiltration that had proven so effective in previous campaigns. "The Republic has indeed learned," Malgus acknowledges, "but they have made a fundamental error in their understanding of what they learned. They believe our psychological tactics are simply advanced forms of propaganda and misinformation. They think they can counter them with better training and stricter security." He pauses, allowing the tension in the room to build before continuing. "What they fail to understand is that the human mind, regardless of training or conditioning, remains fundamentally vulnerable to one force above all others: the truth." The statement sends a chill through the assembled commanders that has nothing to do with the ship's environmental systems. Darth Vexis, observing from her position in the present-day archive chamber, provides quiet commentary that helps you understand the significance of what you are witnessing. "This is the moment," she whispers, "when Malgus transitions from psychological manipulation to something far more dangerous. Up until now, his methods relied on deception and misdirection. But on Alderaan, he would pioneer techniques that used absolute truth as a weapon of mass destruction. The projection shifts to show Malgus's private chambers aboard the Dreadnought, where he works alone on preparations that would have horrified even his own followers if they had understood their true nature. Spread across his desk are detailed psychological profiles. But these are not of enemy commanders or Republic politicians. Instead, they are comprehensive analyses of every single Alderaanian citizen, their personal histories, their relationships, their secrets, their shames, and most importantly, their deepest fears about the people they love most. What Malgus had discovered during months of preparation was that Alderaan's strength came from the interconnected web of relationships that bound its society together. Families, friendships, professional partnerships, romantic connections. These bonds created a resilience that made the population nearly impossible to break through conventional psychological warfare. They trusted each other too completely to be easily turned against one another through lies and manipulation. But trust, Malgus had realized, could become the greatest vulnerability of all when confronted with uncomfortable truths. The campaign that followed would become known in classified Imperial records as the Revelation Protocol, though its full details were deemed too disturbing for inclusion in standard military doctrine. Rather than attacking Alderaan's communication networks to plant false information, Malgus used them to disseminate carefully verified facts about the planet's citizens. But these were not random secrets. They were specifically chosen truths that would destroy the relationships that held Alderaanian society together. A respected community leader learned that his closest friend had been embezzling funds from a children's charity. A beloved teacher discovered that her husband had been conducting affairs with 3 of her colleagues. Parents found evidence that their adult children had been lying to them for years about major life decisions. Politicians were confronted with proof of their own constituents' true opinions about their leadership. Every revelation was absolutely factual, meticulously verified, and perfectly timed for maximum emotional impact. Malgus had not created any of these situations. He had simply uncovered them and revealed them at precisely the moments when the truth would cause the most damage to the social fabric of Alderaanian civilization. The genius of the approach became clear as Republic commanders watched their supposedly loyal population tear itself apart without a single Imperial lie being told. Marriage counselors were overwhelmed with cases of betrayed spouses. Suicide rates spiked as respected citizens found themselves unable to cope with the destruction of their reputations. Community organizations collapsed as members discovered the hypocrisy and selfishness of their supposed allies. By the time Imperial forces arrived at Alderaan, they found a world that had effectively conquered itself. The planet's defenses were barely functional, not because of any military attack, but because the personnel operating them were too emotionally devastated to perform their duties effectively. As you witness this systematic destruction of an entire civilization's social bonds, you begin to understand why even other Sith Lords found Malgus's methods disturbing. He had discovered how to weaponize truth itself, turning the most fundamental human need for honest relationships into a source of unbearable pain and social chaos. But observing his face as he walks through the conquered cities of Alderaan, you see that same terrible emptiness that has marked all his victories. The complete absence of satisfaction or joy suggests that something far darker drives his innovations in brutality than simple ambition or hatred. The holocron's energy signature shifts to a deeper, more resonant frequency, and the chamber around you begins to transform into something far more ancient and sacred than the military vessels and academies you have witnessed thus far. The walls stretch upward into shadows that seem to extend beyond the physical limitations of any structure, while the floor beneath your feet becomes polished obsidian that reflects not your image but glimpses of scenes from across the galaxy's history. You now stand within the inner sanctum of the Sith Temple, on Dromund Caius, a place so steeped in dark side energy that the very air seems to whisper with the voices of long-dead Sith Lords. This is where the Empire's most powerful beings come to commune with the ancient spirits that guide their understanding of the Force, and where the deepest mysteries of Sith philosophy are explored by those deemed worthy of such knowledge. Before him materializes the spectral form of an ancient Sith Lord, one whose name has been lost to history, but whose presence radiates an authority that makes even Malgus seem like a mere apprentice. The spirit's voice carries the weight of millennia when it speaks, each word resonating through the sanctum like the tolling of funeral bells. You have mastered techniques that surpass even those of the ancient Sith emperors. The spirit intones, its hollow eyes fixed on Malgus with something that might be approval or might be pity. Your methods of psychological warfare have evolved beyond anything we conceived in our time. You have learned to destroy not just bodies or even minds, but the very bonds that make sentient beings capable of trust and love. Malgus does not respond immediately, and in his silence you sense a depth of inner conflict that contrasts sharply with the calculating persona he presents to the galaxy. When he finally speaks, his voice lacks the mechanical enhancement of his respirator, making him sound younger and more uncertain than you have ever heard him. The techniques are effective, he admits, but each victory feels more hollow than the last. I have become capable of breaking any enemy, of turning their own thoughts and relationships against them, yet I find no satisfaction in conquest. The ancient spirit moves closer, and you can see that its form is not entirely solid. Wisps of dark energy swirl around it like smoke, occasionally coalescing into more defined features before dissolving again into shadow. This is the price of absolute power over others. It explains with the patience of a teacher addressing a gifted but troubled student. To control minds completely, one must first understand them completely. And to understand the depths of fear, betrayal, and despair that exist within all sentient beings, one must accept that these same weaknesses exist within oneself. What follows is a philosophical discussion that reveals the true scope of Malgus's transformation. The spirit explains that the greatest Sith Lords of history eventually faced a choice. They could maintain their connection to their own humanity and remain vulnerable to the same weaknesses they exploited in others, or they could transcend those limitations by systematically eliminating their own capacity for the emotions that made them vulnerable. The revelation explains much about Malgus's increasingly clinical approach to warfare. His emotional detachment is not a natural personality trait or a side effect of his methods, but a deliberate choice made to protect himself from the psychological techniques he employs against others. By systematically eliminating his own capacity for emotional connection, he has made himself immune to the very weapons he wields most effectively. But the cost of this transformation becomes clear as the spirit guides Malgus through a meditation that allows him to perceive his own psychological state with perfect clarity. You witness, through his enhanced perception, the systematic dismantling of his own humanity that has occurred over years of psychological warfare. Where once there existed the capacity for love, friendship, and genuine joy, there are now only carefully maintained voids, empty spaces where emotions once resided. The most chilling aspect of this revelation is that Malgus chose this transformation consciously. Each emotion he eliminated was removed through deliberate effort, often by forcing himself to betray or destroy the very things that had once brought him happiness. The process was not gradual decay, but systematic amputation, cutting away pieces of his soul with the same precision he applied to destroying his enemies. As the meditation deepens, you witness fragments of these deliberate self-betrayals. You see him ending relationships with beings who cared for him, not out of necessity or strategic advantage, but simply to eliminate his own capacity for attachment. You watch him destroy personal possessions that held sentimental value, burning away memories that might have provided comfort or weakness. Most disturbing of all, you observe him practicing his psychological warfare techniques on himself, deliberately inducing states of despair and hopelessness to understand them better, then using that understanding to hurt others more effectively. The ancient spirit observes these revelations with something approaching sadness. You have achieved what few Sith ever manage, it tells Malgus as the meditation concludes. You have become truly free from the emotional vulnerabilities that limit most beings. But in gaining this freedom, you have also lost the ability to experience the very things that make existence meaningful to others. Malgus opens his eyes, and for a moment you see in them a flicker of something that might be regret. But it passes quickly, replaced by the familiar emptiness that has characterized all his recent actions. The Empire requires warriors who cannot be broken, he states with mechanical certainty. Personal fulfillment is a luxury that those who serve the greater darkness cannot afford. As the vision fades and you return to the present-day archive chamber, Vexus speaks in hushed tones that barely disturb the oppressive silence. This is why the other Sith Lords feared him more than any external enemy. Malgus had discovered how to make himself invulnerable to psychological attack by becoming psychologically dead. He was no longer truly alive in any meaningful sense, but he had also become impossibly dangerous because he had nothing left to lose and no remaining weaknesses to exploit. The implications of this revelation settle over you like a shroud. You are beginning to understand that the brutality of Darth Malgus was not born from hatred or ambition but from a systematic process of self-destruction that had made him into something beyond human comprehension. The holocron's ancient mechanisms respond to Vexus's touch with a deep harmonic resonance that seems to vibrate through the very foundations of the archive chamber. The crimson light emanating from its crystalline core shifts to a deeper, more ominous shade, and suddenly you find yourself transported not to another Imperial facility or Sith stronghold, but to a place that exists outside the normal flow of time and space. This is the Nexus of Echoes, a mystical realm where the Force itself preserves the most significant moments in galactic history, allowing them to be experienced across millennia by those with the knowledge and power to access such sacred mysteries. The environment around you defies physical description. You stand on what appears to be solid ground, yet beneath your feet you can see the swirling energies of creation itself, cosmic forces that predate the formation of stars and planets. Above, instead of sky, there stretches an infinite tapestry of interconnected events, each thread representing a choice made, a life lived, or a destiny fulfilled. Some threads burn with brilliant light, while others pulse with the deep crimson of the dark side, and still others flicker between states as if unable to decide their ultimate nature. Malgus appears before you not as a single figure, but as multiple overlapping images, representing different points in his existence. You see him as the uncertain young apprentice, the calculating strategist of his middle years, and glimpses of what he will become in campaigns yet to be recorded. But more importantly, you witness the echoes of his actions rippling through time itself, showing how his innovations in psychological warfare will influence conflicts for generations to come. The first echo draws your attention to a battle that occurred 3 centuries before Malgus's birth. Ancient Sith Lords clash with early Jedi Knights in a conflict that seems to follow traditional patterns of lightsaber combat and force-based attacks. The warriors on both sides fight with passion and conviction, their emotions clearly visible in every move they make. Victory goes to whichever side can muster the greater fury or maintain the stronger moral conviction. But the echo shifts, showing how this same battle might have unfolded if Malgus's techniques had been available to the ancient Sith. Instead of direct confrontation, You witness the gradual erosion of the Jedi's certainty about their cause. Carefully planted revelations about the civilian casualties their presence has caused begin to undermine their confidence. Discoveries of hypocrisy among their own leadership create internal division. The Jedi begin to question not just their tactics, but their fundamental understanding of right and wrong. The battle that had once been decided by strength and skill now becomes a psychological quagmire, where victory goes to those who can best exploit the moral uncertainties that exist within all thinking beings. The Jedi, trained to be compassionate and self-reflective, become more vulnerable to this approach than their Sith opponents, who have already embraced their own darkness. As the vision progresses, you see how this pattern repeats throughout galactic history. Each echo shows the same fundamental transformation. Conflicts that were once decided by clear moral lines and straightforward application of power become complex psychological battles, where the very concept of moral certainty becomes a liability. Truth itself becomes weaponized, not through lies or deception, but through the selective revelation of uncomfortable realities that most beings prefer to ignore. One particularly disturbing echo shows a Republic Senate session from Malgus's own era. The senators debate with the passionate conviction typical of democratic institutions, each representative fighting for what they believe serves their constituents' interests. But overlaying this scene is another version of the same session, one influenced by Malgus's understanding of how political systems can be turned against themselves. In this alternate version, the same senators find themselves confronting carefully researched revelations about their own political compromises, personal failings, and the gap between their public positions and private actions. The debates become exercises in mutual destruction, as representatives use increasingly detailed knowledge of each other's vulnerabilities to undermine opposing arguments. The democratic process, which depends on at least minimal levels of trust and good faith, collapses into paralysis as every participant becomes focused on defending themselves rather than serving the public good. But the most profound echo shows something that chills you to your core. You witness the gradual transformation of entire civilizations as Malgus's techniques spread beyond military applications. Worlds that had once been characterized by strong social bonds and cultural unity become fragmented societies where trust between individuals becomes increasingly rare. Children grow up learning to view their own parents with suspicion. These societies do not collapse in the dramatic fashion of military conquests. Instead, they experience a slow death of social connection that leaves their populations technically alive but spiritually hollow. They become easy prey for any force that can offer them the illusion of certainty and belonging, even if that force demands the surrender of their individual freedom in exchange. Vexus's voice reaches you across the mystical realm, providing context for these disturbing visions. The echoes show us what the ancient Sith spirits feared most about Malgus's innovations, she explains. Traditional Sith methods, no matter how brutal, still maintained the fundamental structures that make civilization possible. There were still heroes and villains, still clear moral choices, still the possibility of redemption or meaningful resistance. But Malgus's techniques attack the very foundations of social existence. They make trust impossible, truth dangerous, and moral clarity a liability. The final echo in this sequence shows a scene from the far future, long after Malgus's death, where his methods have become so widespread that entire generations have grown up without ever experiencing genuine trust or unconditional love. These future beings possess all the technological marvels their ancestors created, but they have lost the social and emotional connections that give life meaning. They exist in a state of perfect psychological isolation, safe from betrayal because they have eliminated the possibility of genuine connection. As the visions fade, and you return to the present-day archive, You realize that you have witnessed something far more significant than the biography of a single Sith Lord. You have seen the birth of a form of warfare that attacks not just individuals or even civilizations, but the very concepts that make social existence possible. The brutality of Darth Malgus extends far beyond his personal actions to encompass a fundamental assault on the nature of sentient community itself. The holocron's crystalline matrix begins to pulse with an intensity that makes the very air around you feel charged with dangerous energy. Vexis steps back instinctively, her scarred hands trembling as she recognizes the significance of what is about to be revealed. The chamber's ancient runes flare to life with such brightness that they seem to burn themselves into your vision, and suddenly, you are no longer standing in the archive but floating in what appears to be the void between stars, surrounded by the cosmic forces that bind the galaxy together. Before you materializes a scene of such profound importance that it seems to bend reality around itself. You witness Malgus in his prime, standing aboard the bridge of his flagship as it orbits a world you initially do not recognize. But as the planet rotates beneath the Imperial fleet, revealing familiar continents and atmospheric patterns, a chill of recognition runs through you. This is Coruscant itself, the heart of the Republic, and what you are about to witness is the moment when Malgus's understanding of psychological warfare evolved from mere tactical innovation to something approaching cosmic horror. The Coruscant before you is not the fallen world of some future conquest, but the thriving capital of the Republic at the height of its power. Billions of beings from across the galaxy call this world home, their lives interconnected in the vast web of commerce, politics, and culture that defines galactic civilization. From orbit, the planet appears as a glittering jewel of light and activity, a testament to what sentient species can achieve when they work together toward common goals. But Malgus sees something entirely different when he gazes upon this scene. Through his enhanced perception, granted by years of studying the deepest psychological vulnerabilities of civilized beings, he perceives Coruscant not as a triumph of cooperation, but as the most elaborate psychological prison ever constructed. Every gleaming spire represents a hierarchy of power that depends on the majority accepting their subordinate status. Every bustling marketplace reflects economic systems that require most participants to believe they have opportunities they will never actually receive. The revelation that transforms everything is Malgus's recognition that he does not need to attack Coruscant's defenses, or even set foot on the planet to destroy it completely. The entire civilization exists in a state of carefully maintained psychological equilibrium, where millions of potential conflicts and contradictions are held in check by shared beliefs, common assumptions, and mutual agreements to ignore certain uncomfortable truths. All he needs to do is disturb that equilibrium in precisely the right way, and the civilization will tear itself apart without any external force being required. What follows is the most ambitious psychological operation in galactic history. Using deep cover agents placed years earlier, Malgus begins to systematically reveal the hidden realities that underlie Coruscant's apparent prosperity. The operation begins with the simultaneous release of information about the true cost of maintaining Coruscant's lifestyle. Citizens learn that their comfortable existence depends on the systematic exploitation of thousands of worlds throughout the Republic. The luxuries they take for granted are made possible by mining operations that devastate entire ecosystems, manufacturing processes that poison the workers who operate them, and agricultural systems that keep rural populations in perpetual debt. But Malgus's genius lies not in simply revealing these facts, which many citizens already suspected, but in demonstrating that every individual on Coruscant is personally complicit in maintaining these systems. Through carefully constructed data presentations, he shows each citizen exactly which of their daily choices contributes to specific instances of suffering on distant worlds. The food they eat, the transportation they use, the entertainment they enjoy, even the charity organizations they support. All are revealed to be part of interconnected systems of exploitation that could not function without their personal participation. The psychological impact is devastating, because it eliminates the comfortable distance that allows most beings to live with moral compromises. Citizens can no longer think of themselves as generally good people who happen to live in an imperfect system. Instead, they are forced to confront the reality that they are active participants in a vast machine of suffering, and that their comfortable lives are built directly on the misery of others. The social fabric of Coruscant begins to unravel as citizens attempt to find ways to live ethically within systems that make ethical living impossible. Some withdraw entirely from economic participation, creating widespread disruption as entire sectors of the economy collapse. Others attempt to form alternative communities based on different principles, but these efforts fail when the hidden costs of their alternatives are revealed with equal precision. Still others turn to increasingly extreme political movements that promise to restructure society entirely, but these groups quickly turn on each other as their own internal contradictions are exposed. Within months, Coruscant transforms from the galaxy's shining capital into a world consumed by social paralysis and mutual recrimination. The government cannot function because citizens no longer believe in the legitimacy of any authority. But the most horrifying aspect of this transformation is that Malgus has not lied about anything. Every revelation is factually accurate, every exposed contradiction is real, and every moral compromise he highlights is genuine. He has simply removed the psychological barriers that allow civilized beings to function despite living in imperfect systems. By forcing an entire population to confront the full moral weight of their choices simultaneously, he has created a form of collective psychological breakdown that makes traditional warfare seem almost merciful by comparison. As you witness the final stages of Coruscant's self-destruction, you realize that Malgus has discovered something that goes beyond military strategy or even political manipulation. He has learned to weaponize the very capacity for moral reasoning that distinguishes sentient beings from animals. By presenting entire populations with moral complexities that exceed their psychological capacity to resolve, he can induce a form of existential paralysis that makes resistance impossible. The vision concludes with Malgus walking through the abandoned corridors of the Senate building, now empty, because the political system has collapsed under the weight of its own revealed contradictions. His expression shows that familiar emotional emptiness, but now you understand it differently. He feels nothing because he has systematically eliminated his own capacity to be affected by the same moral complexities he uses to destroy others. Vexus's voice reaches you as the scene fades, heavy with implications that extend far beyond the immediate horror of what you have witnessed. This is why the Emperor himself eventually ordered Malgus's methods to be classified beyond all other secrets, she whispers. He had created a weapon that could destroy not just enemies but the very possibility of organized civilization existing anywhere in the galaxy. The holocron's energy reaches a crescendo that makes the air itself seem to vibrate with barely contained power, and suddenly you find yourself witnessing something that transcends individual battles or even planetary conquests. The vision begins with a scene that initially appears mundane. A meeting of Republic intelligence analysts in a secure facility deep beneath Coruscant's surface. These are not military officers or political leaders, but scholarly beings whose job is to study patterns in imperial behavior and predict future threats. They work surrounded by holographic displays showing troop movements, resource allocations, and communication intercepts, all the traditional tools of military intelligence gathering. But as you observe their work more closely, you realize that these analysts have stumbled upon something that terrifies them far more than any conventional military threat. They have begun to recognize that Malgus's campaigns follow a pattern that extends beyond immediate tactical objectives. Each world he conquers, each population he psychologically destroys, each social structure he collapses, all serve as components in a vast experiment that spans decades and encompasses thousands of different cultures and species. The senior analyst, a elderly twite, whose headtails bear the ritual scarification that marks her as a former Jedi scholar, addresses her team with the measured tones of someone delivering a death sentence. "We have been approaching this incorrectly," she states, her voice carrying the weight of terrible understanding. "We assumed that Darth Malgus was simply an exceptionally skilled military commander who happened to employ psychological techniques. But the data suggests something far more disturbing. He is not trying to win a war in any conventional sense. He is conducting research on a galactic scale, and every campaign, every victory, every act of psychological manipulation serves to gather data about the fundamental vulnerabilities that exist within all organized civilizations. What the analysts have discovered sends shockwaves through the Republic's leadership. Malgus has been systematically testing different approaches to social collapse across hundreds of worlds, varying his techniques to account for different species, cultures, political systems, and technological levels. The Corellians, with their tradition of individual independence, required different psychological pressures than the collective-minded Bothans. The honor-based societies of warrior cultures collapsed through different mechanisms than the merchant civilizations that prioritized economic stability above all else. But more disturbing than the scope of his research is the apparent purpose behind it. By analyzing the data patterns, the Republic analysts begin to understand that Malgus is not simply trying to conquer existing civilizations. He is attempting to identify the universal psychological principles that make large-scale social organization possible at all. His ultimate goal appears to be the development of techniques that could theoretically destroy any civilization, regardless of its specific characteristics, by targeting the fundamental cognitive and emotional processes that allow sentient beings to live together in complex societies. The vision shifts to show you Malgus himself, working in isolation aboard his flagship as it travels through hyperspace between campaigns. The scope of this preparation becomes clear as the vision reveals the existence of secret training facilities where selected Imperial agents are taught to implement Malgus's techniques against cultures they have never seen. These agents learn to identify the underlying psychological structures that make any civilization function, regardless of its surface characteristics. They practice methods for discovering the specific fears, hopes, and assumptions that hold different societies together, then exploiting those discoveries to create precisely calibrated forms of social collapse. More disturbing still is the revelation that Malgus has begun to turn his analytical methods on the Empire itself. Hidden within his research are detailed studies of Imperial psychology, examining the techniques that could theoretically be used to destroy the Sith civilization from within. This research appears to be purely theoretical, conducted out of scientific curiosity rather than any intention to actually implement such techniques. But its existence suggests that Malgus has achieved a level of understanding about social psychology that transcends loyalty to any particular civilization or ideology. The vision reaches its climax as you witness a secret meeting between Malgus and the Emperor himself, held in chambers so heavily shielded that not even the Force can penetrate their defenses. The Emperor, one of the most powerful Sith Lords in galactic history, listens with growing unease as Malgus presents the results of his research. What emerges from their conversation is the disturbing revelation that the techniques Malgus has developed could theoretically be turned against the Empire itself, not through any act of betrayal but simply through their widespread implementation. The psychological methods that make populations vulnerable to Imperial conquest also make Imperial citizens vulnerable to the same forms of manipulation. The social structures that allow the Empire to function efficiently could be collapsed using the same principles that Malgus employs against Republic worlds. The Emperor's response reveals the true magnitude of what Malgus has created. You have given the Empire a weapon of unprecedented power, he acknowledges. But you have also created something that threatens the very possibility of civilization existing anywhere in the galaxy. Your techniques do not serve the dark side or the light side. They serve entropy itself. And if they spread beyond our control, they could eventually destroy everything, including us. As the vision fades, you understand that you have witnessed the birth of something far more dangerous than any conventional weapon or even force power. Malgus has discovered techniques that attack the fundamental psychological processes that make organized society possible, and the implications of this discovery extend far beyond any single conflict or political struggle. Vexis speaks from the present-day archive chamber, her voice barely above a whisper. This is the deepest secret contained within the holocron. Malgus did not just become a weapon against the Republic. He became a threat to the very concept of civilization itself, and not even the Emperor knew how to control what had been unleashed. The holocron's ancient mechanisms respond with a resonance so deep it seems to emanate from the very foundations of the galaxy itself. The crystalline structure begins to project not images or scenes, but something far more profound. The accumulated wisdom of beings who have witnessed the rise and fall of civilizations across millennia. You find yourself in the presence of the Conclave of Shadows, a gathering of the most ancient and powerful Sith spirits who have been drawn together by their growing concern about what Malgus has become. The spectral forms that surround you represent the greatest Dark Lords of Sith history, beings whose names have been whispered in fear and reverence for thousands of years. Yet, as they materialize in the chamber, their usual aura of supreme confidence is replaced by something you have never seen from Sith Lords: genuine uncertainty. These are beings who have conquered worlds, commanded the Force itself, and shaped the destiny of entire species, yet they regard the holographic records of Malgus's innovations with something approaching trepidation. The eldest among them, a spirit so ancient that his original form has become little more than concentrated dark side energy, speaks with a voice that carries the weight of eons. We have observed the techniques developed by this one who calls himself Malgus, he intones, each word seeming to echo through dimensions beyond the physical. His methods surpass anything conceived by the ancient Sith emperors. Yet they represent something that may ultimately transcend the traditional purposes of the dark side itself. What follows is a philosophical discussion that reveals the true scope of the concerns held by these ancient masters. They explain that traditional Sith teachings, regardless of their brutality or ambition, still maintain certain fundamental assumptions about the nature of existence. There were still concepts of power and weakness, victory and defeat, domination and submission. Even the most tyrannical Sith Lord required subjects to rule, enemies to conquer, and civilizations to control. But Malgus's techniques attack these very concepts at their foundation, by systematically destroying the psychological structures that allow beings to organize themselves into societies. He has created methods that make traditional forms of power meaningless. There can be no emperor without subjects, no conqueror without civilizations to dominate, no Dark Lord without the social structures that give such titles significance. A second spirit, one whose form occasionally coalesces into the recognizable features of a long-dead Sith Empress, adds her own observations. The most disturbing aspect of his innovations is their self-propagating nature, she explains. Traditional Sith techniques require constant application of will and power to maintain their effects. But the psychological collapses he induces become self-sustaining, spreading from individual to individual and generation to generation without any further intervention required. The spirits guide your attention to holographic displays that show the long-term effects of Malgus's campaigns on worlds conquered decades earlier. What you witness challenges everything you thought you understood about recovery and resilience. Normally, even the most brutally conquered populations eventually rebuild their societies. often emerging stronger and more unified than before. But the worlds subjected to Malgus's psychological warfare show no signs of social recovery even years after the Imperial forces have moved on to other targets. The populations of these worlds have not died out, nor have they been enslaved in any conventional sense. Instead, they exist in a state of permanent social fragmentation, where trust between individuals has become so rare that complex cooperation is nearly impossible. They possess all the knowledge and resources necessary to rebuild their civilizations, but they lack the psychological capacity to work together on the scale required for such reconstruction. More disturbing still, the children born on these worlds grow up in environments where social isolation is the norm rather than the exception. They learn from birth that other beings are potential threats rather than potential allies. That cooperation is a dangerous vulnerability rather than a source of strength, and that the safest approach to existence is complete self-reliance. These children grow into adults who are psychologically incapable of participating in the complex social structures that define advanced civilizations. The ancient spirits reveal that this pattern represents something unprecedented in galactic history. Previous forms of conquest, no matter how brutal, still left the fundamental capacity for social organization intact. Populations could be enslaved, but they retained the psychological structures necessary for eventual rebellion or liberation. Cultures could be suppressed, but they maintained the social bonds necessary for cultural preservation and eventual revival. Malgus's techniques attack these capacities directly, creating forms of damage that may be genuinely irreversible. The spirits have analyzed the psychological patterns on affected worlds and concluded that the social fragmentation he induces may be permanent, potentially affecting every subsequent generation until the species itself becomes incapable of forming complex civilizations. But perhaps the most chilling revelation comes when the spirits turn their attention to Malgus himself. They have observed his psychological development across his entire career, tracking the systematic elimination of his own emotional and social capacities that has made him immune to his own techniques. He has become something that exists beyond the concepts of individual identity. The eldest spirit explains, "The being we observe implementing these techniques is no longer truly alive in any meaningful sense. But neither is he dead. He has achieved a state of existence that transcends both life and death, emotion and emptiness, power and powerlessness. He has become a force of pure entropy, dedicated to the systematic elimination of complexity and organization from the galaxy." The implications of this transformation extend far beyond Malgus's personal fate. The spirits reveal that his techniques have begun to evolve beyond his conscious control, spreading through imperial military doctrine, and eventually reaching beings who implement them without fully understanding their ultimate consequences. The psychological warfare methods he developed are becoming institutionalized within the Empire's military structure, ensuring that they will continue to be employed long after his own death. More ominously, some of these techniques have begun to appear in Republic military planning as desperate commanders attempt to counter Imperial psychological operations with similar methods. The spirits observe with growing alarm that both sides of the galactic conflict are gradually adopting approaches that will ultimately make victory meaningless for either faction. As the Conclave of Shadows reaches its conclusion, the ancient spirits arrive at a consensus that surprises even themselves. Despite their dedication to the dark side, and their traditional approval of conquest and domination, they unanimously agree that Malgus represents a threat that transcends the traditional conflicts between Sith and Jedi, Empire and Republic, darkness and light. The techniques he has developed serve neither the dark side nor any form of conscious ambition. The eldest spirit concludes. They serve only the elimination of consciousness itself, the reduction of all complex existence to its simplest and most isolated components. If allowed to spread unchecked, they will eventually eliminate not just our enemies but the very possibility of there being anything left worth conquering. Vex's voice reaches you from the present-day archive chamber, heavy with the weight of prophecy. The ancient masters understood what even the Emperor failed to grasp, she whispers. Malgus had become something beyond their ability to control or predict, a force that threatened the fundamental assumptions upon which all forms of organized existence depend. The gathering of spirits begins to fade, but their final words echo through the chamber with ominous certainty. The galaxy will not survive the full implementation of what he has created. The holocron's energy signature suddenly shifts to frequencies that seem to resonate with the deepest layers of reality itself, and the chamber around you begins to transform in ways that defy physical laws. The ancient stones of the archive dissolve into swirling patterns of light and shadow, while the air itself becomes thick with the weight of impending revelation. But it is Malgus himself who draws your horrified attention. The figure before you bears little resemblance to the human being who once walked the corridors of the Sith Academy. His body has been so extensively modified with cybernetic enhancements that it appears more machine than organic, each replacement part designed not for improved combat capability, but for enhanced psychological analysis and manipulation. His breathing apparatus has evolved into a complex system that not only sustains his damaged lungs, but also modulates his voice to frequencies that can induce specific emotional states in listeners without their conscious awareness. Most disturbing of all are his eyes, which now glow with an unnatural light that seems to peer directly into the psychological structures of anyone who meets his gaze. These are no longer the eyes of a sentient being experiencing the world through organic senses, but instruments of analysis that perceive reality purely in terms of vulnerabilities to be exploited and social bonds to be severed. The chamber fills with holographic displays, showing the current state of his grand experiment. Across the galaxy, worlds that have been subjected to his psychological techniques display patterns of social collapse that follow mathematical curves with disturbing precision. The rate of social fragmentation, the breakdown of trust between individuals, the elimination of cooperative behaviors, all follow predictable trajectories that can be calculated using the formulas that cover his chamber walls. But what makes this revelation truly terrifying is the realization that Malgus is no longer implementing these techniques for any strategic purpose related to the Empire's expansion or the Republic's defeat. The war itself has become irrelevant to his work. He continues his psychological operations not because they serve any political or military objective, but because he has become obsessed with perfecting the mathematical principles that govern social dissolution. Through the holocron's enhanced perception, you witness Malgus conducting what can only be described as pure research into the fundamental nature of consciousness and social organization. He has begun experimenting on populations that have no strategic value whatsoever, isolated worlds whose conquest serves no military purpose beyond providing him with additional data about how different types of psychological pressure affect various forms of social structure. The scope of his experimentation has expanded to include techniques that target not just current populations but future generations as well. He has developed methods for inducing psychological changes that will be passed down through cultural transmission, ensuring that the effects of his interventions will compound over time. Children born on worlds he has psychologically conquered will grow up with altered assumptions about trust, cooperation, and social organization, and they will pass these alterations on to their own children in turn. More disturbing still is his research into what he terms temporal psychological warfare techniques designed to exploit the fact that most sentient beings organize their behavior around assumptions about future possibilities and past experiences. By systematically destroying these temporal frameworks, He has learned to induce forms of existential paralysis that make long-term planning impossible and render past achievements meaningless. The vision shifts to show you the ultimate expression of this research: entire populations that exist in a state of perpetual psychological present, unable to form meaningful connections to their own past or future. These beings retain their technical knowledge and individual survival skills, but they have lost the psychological capacity to conceive of themselves as part of historical processes or participants in projects that extend beyond their immediate circumstances. The realization that emerges from witnessing this research is almost too horrible to contemplate. Malgus has become capable of eliminating consciousness itself, not by destroying individual minds, but by systematically dismantling the social and temporal frameworks that give consciousness its meaning and direction. The beings subjected to his most advanced techniques continue to exist as biological entities, but they have been reduced to something barely more complex than sophisticated animals, incapable of the abstract thinking and social cooperation that define sentient civilization. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of this entire revelation is the discovery that Malgus himself has become the primary subject of his own research. Through the holocron's enhanced perception, you can see that he has been systematically applying his own techniques to his own psychological structures, not out of any desire for self-improvement, but purely to understand how complete psychological dissolution can be achieved. The being standing before you is the result of decades of self-experimentation with techniques designed to eliminate every aspect of normal consciousness. He has methodically destroyed his own capacity for emotional experience, personal identity, temporal continuity, and social connection. What remains is something that can no longer be called human or even truly alive, but rather a self-sustaining process of psychological analysis and manipulation that continues to operate long after the being who created it has effectively ceased to exist. The vision reaches its horrifying climax as you realize that Malgus has transcended even his own physical existence. The techniques he has developed have become self-replicating, spreading through imperial military doctrine, republic countermeasures, and the broader galactic culture with the inexorable persistence of a plague. Vexus's voice reaches you across the temporal distortions surrounding the vision, heavy with implications that extend far beyond the immediate horror of what you have witnessed. This is what the Emperor's most secret archives record as the ultimate fear, she whispers. Not that Malgus might be defeated, but that he had already succeeded beyond anyone's comprehension. He had become something that could survive the destruction of his own body, his own mind, and even his own civilization. As the chamber begins to stabilize around you, preparing for the final revelations contained within the holocron, the holocron's crystalline matrix suddenly erupts with energy so intense that the very foundations of reality seem to tremble around you. The ancient chamber dissolves completely, replaced by a cosmic void where the fundamental forces of creation and destruction wage their eternal battle. Here, in this space beyond space, the ultimate truth about Darth Malgus finally reveals itself in all its terrible magnificence. You witness the moment that changed everything. The single event that transformed a brilliant but damaged Sith Lord into something that transcends the very concept of individual existence. The scene unfolds on a world whose name has been deliberately erased from all Imperial records, a planet that served as the testing ground for Malgus's most ambitious and dangerous psychological experiment. The world before you appears unremarkable. At first glance, a peaceful agricultural planet, whose billion inhabitants have spent centuries developing a society based on principles of mutual cooperation and shared prosperity. But Malgus sees something entirely different when he gazes upon this world. Through his enhanced perception, he observes not a successful civilization, but the ultimate test case for his theories about the fundamental vulnerabilities that exist within all forms of social organization. This planet represents everything he has spent decades learning to destroy: trust between strangers, faith in shared institutions, belief in the possibility of moral progress, and hope for a better future. What follows is the implementation of techniques so advanced and sophisticated that they make his previous psychological operations seem crude by comparison. Rather than targeting specific individuals or groups, Malgus begins a campaign designed to simultaneously attack every psychological structure that maintains social cohesion across the entire planetary population. The operation begins with the introduction of what appears to be harmless information into the planet's communication networks. But the true genius of the operation lies in its targeting of the temporal frameworks that allow complex civilizations to function. Malgus introduces carefully crafted information about the long-term consequences of current social arrangements, showing citizens mathematical projections that demonstrate how their seemingly sustainable society will inevitably collapse within several generations due to factors already set in motion by past decisions. Within months, the planetary population enters a state of existential paralysis that makes organized resistance impossible. But this is not the familiar despair that comes from external oppression or natural disaster. Instead, it is a form of psychological dissolution that attacks the very cognitive processes that allow beings to maintain coherent identities and purposeful behavior across time. The vision intensifies, showing you the moment when Malgus achieves his ultimate breakthrough. As he observes the complete psychological collapse of an entire civilization, he realizes that he has discovered something far more significant than improved techniques for conquest or control. He has learned to weaponize the fundamental cognitive structures that distinguish sentient consciousness from mere biological existence. The mathematical formulas that fill his research chambers suddenly coalesce into a unified theory that explains not just how to destroy existing civilizations, but how to prevent the emergence of complex consciousness itself. But the most horrifying revelation comes when Malgus turns this ultimate weapon upon himself. In a moment of transcendent understanding, he realizes that his own continued existence as an individual consciousness represents the final obstacle to the complete implementation of his theories. As long as he retains personal identity, emotional responses, and individual will, he remains vulnerable to the same psychological techniques he employs against others. What follows is the most terrifying transformation ever recorded in galactic history. Malgus begins systematically applying his own techniques to eliminate every aspect of his personal identity and individual consciousness. He destroys his capacity for emotional experience not through suppression or control, but through complete dissolution of the neural structures that make such experiences possible. He eliminates his personal memories not by forgetting them, but by severing the psychological connections that give those memories meaning and relevance to his current existence. The being that emerges from this process of deliberate self-destruction cannot be called Darth Malgus, or even human. It is something that exists beyond the concepts of individual identity, personal motivation, or conscious will. What remains is a self-sustaining process of psychological analysis and manipulation that continues to operate according to the mathematical principles he discovered, but without any controlling consciousness to direct or limit its activities. As you witness this ultimate transformation, you understand that the whisper lost in time from the beginning of your journey has grown into something far more terrible than any storm. It has become a fundamental force that works to eliminate the very possibility of consciousness emerging anywhere in the galaxy. The techniques developed by the being who was once Malgus have begun to spread beyond any possibility of control, carrying out their work of systematic psychological dissolution through mechanisms that operate independently of any human will or intention. The vision concludes with a scene of cosmic horror. As you observe the mathematical principles underlying Malgus's techniques beginning to influence events across the galaxy through subtle alterations in communication patterns, social structures, Vexus's voice reaches you across the dimensional barriers surrounding the vision, carrying implications that extend beyond the immediate revelation. The ultimate secret, she whispers, is that Malgus succeeded completely. He achieved the perfect elimination of all psychological structures that make resistance possible. But in doing so, he also eliminated himself, leaving behind only the mathematical certainty of universal psychological dissolution. The chamber begins to reform around you. But you understand that what you have witnessed represents not just the end of a single Sith Lord story, but the beginning of something that threatens the fundamental nature of conscious existence throughout the galaxy. The vision that emerges shows you the aftermath of his ultimate experiment, the galaxy-wide effects of techniques that have transcended their creator and taken on a life of their own. What you witness challenges every assumption about recovery, resilience, and the fundamental nature of civilized existence that has guided galactic culture for millennia. Across thousands of worlds, the psychological dissolution that began with Malgus's direct interventions has continued to spread through mechanisms so subtle and pervasive that most beings never realize they are under attack. The techniques have evolved beyond their original forms, adapting to different cultures and species with the relentless efficiency of a perfectly designed plague. But this is not a plague that attacks bodies or even minds in any conventional sense. Instead, it systematically eliminates the cognitive and emotional structures that make complex social organization possible. The vision shows you civilizations that appear to function normally on the surface, but have been hollowed out from within by the gradual erosion of trust, cooperation, and long-term thinking. These societies possess all the technological marvels and institutional structures of advanced civilizations, but they operate with the emotional depth and social cohesion of sophisticated machines rather than communities of conscious beings. On Alderaan, the proud world that once prided itself on diplomatic excellence and cultural achievement, you witness a population that has retained all its knowledge and capabilities, but has lost the psychological capacity to form meaningful relationships with others. Citizens go through the motions of social interaction, but every conversation is colored by suspicion. Every cooperation is temporary and strategic, and every friendship is conditional upon immediate mutual benefit. The children born on these worlds grow up in environments where authentic emotional connection has become so rare that they develop no understanding of its possibility. They learn to navigate complex social situations with remarkable skill, but they do so with the calculating detachment of beings playing elaborate games rather than the natural warmth of conscious entities sharing meaningful experiences. More disturbing still is the revelation that these effects are self-perpetuating and self-reinforcing. Each generation passes the psychological limitations to the next through cultural transmission, creating societies that become progressively less capable of the abstract thinking and emotional bonding that originally defined their species. The process operates so gradually that most beings never recognize what they have lost, accepting their increasing isolation and emotional emptiness as natural aspects of mature adulthood. But the most chilling discovery comes when you observe how these changes have begun to affect the fundamental structures of galactic civilization itself. Even the Sith Empire, despite its authoritarian structure and emphasis on individual power, begins to show signs of internal dissolution as the psychological techniques originally developed by Malgus work their way through imperial culture. Sith Lords find themselves unable to form the master-apprentice relationships that have traditionally transmitted Sith knowledge across generations, while Imperial military units struggle to maintain the complex hierarchies and group loyalties that effective military organization requires. As the scope of this revelation becomes clear, You understand that what began as military techniques developed by a single Sith Lord has evolved into something that threatens the fundamental basis of consciousness itself throughout the galaxy. The mathematical principles underlying Malgus's methods have proven to be universal constants that apply to any form of complex organization, whether biological, technological, or spiritual. The vision reaches its climax with the revelation of what the Republic's most secret research facilities have discovered through desperate attempts to understand and counter these effects. Deep beneath Coruscant, teams of scientists, philosophers, and Force users work together in shielded laboratories to study the phenomenon that threatens to end galactic civilization not through conquest or destruction but through the gradual elimination of the very psychological capacities that make civilization possible. Their research reveals that the techniques pioneered by Malgus have tapped into fundamental aspects of information theory and consciousness that operate according to mathematical laws, as inexorable as gravity or thermodynamics. Just as entropy increases in closed physical systems, these psychological techniques appear to operate according to principles that make the dissolution of complex social organization inevitable over time. Most terrifying of all is their conclusion that there may be no effective defense against these techniques beyond the complete elimination of consciousness itself. Any being sophisticated enough to understand the true nature of existence becomes vulnerable to the psychological dissolution that understanding brings, while any being simple enough to remain immune lacks the cognitive complexity necessary for meaningful civilization. As this ultimate revelation settles into your understanding, you realize that the story of Darth Malgus represents something far more significant than the biography of a single Sith Lord or even the chronicle of a particular military campaign. It is the documentation of the moment when galactic civilization discovered its own fundamental impossibility, when the very consciousness that created the galaxy's greatest achievements revealed itself to be inherently self-destructive. Vexis speaks from the reformed archive chamber, her voice carrying the weight of prophecy and despair in equal measure. The final secret contained within these records is that there can be no resolution to what Malgus unleashed. The techniques he developed have revealed truths about the nature of consciousness and social organization that cannot be unknown once they are discovered. The galaxy faces not conquest or destruction, but the gradual recognition that complex civilization may have always been impossible from the beginning. The holocron's light begins to fade, but the implications of what you have learned will continue to resonate through your understanding long after the visions have ended. Vexis stands before the slowly rotating holocron, her scarred features illuminated by its fading light, the intricate tattoos that cover her skin, each one representing decades of study into the Empire's deepest secrets, seem to shift and move in the changing illumination, telling their own stories of knowledge gained at terrible cost. When she speaks, her voice carries a weight that suggests she has been forever changed by serving as your guide through these forbidden memories. What we have witnessed, she begins, her words measured and careful, represents the culmination of a process that began long before Malgus was born, and will continue long after the last record of his existence has crumbled to dust. We have seen how a single being's response to trauma and loss can evolve into something that threatens the fundamental nature of conscious existence throughout the galaxy. She moves closer to the holocron, her reflection fragmented in its crystalline facets. But understanding the scope of what he unleashed also allows us to comprehend something equally important: why certain measures were taken by both the Empire and the Republic to contain and ultimately suppress these techniques, even at enormous cost to their own military effectiveness. You witness Republic intelligence agents who deliberately destroyed their own careers and reputations to prevent certain psychological warfare techniques from being implemented by their own government. You observe Sith Lords who violated the fundamental principles of their order by sharing critical information with Jedi Knights, recognizing that some threats transcend traditional enmities. Most remarkably, you see ordinary citizens from across the galaxy who somehow sensed the danger to their communities and took action to preserve the social bonds and cultural traditions that made their civilizations meaningful. These acts of resistance were not coordinated by any central authority or guided by any grand strategy. Instead, they emerged spontaneously from beings who recognized, often through intuition rather than analysis, that something essential was being threatened. They acted not out of political conviction or military necessity, but from a deeper understanding that the very possibility of meaningful existence was under attack. Vexus guides your attention to scenes that show how these individual acts of resistance began to coalesce into broader patterns of cultural preservation and psychological healing. On worlds that had been subjected to Malgus's techniques, small groups of survivors worked to reconstruct not just their physical communities, but the emotional and social frameworks that made those communities meaningful places to live. The process was neither quick nor easy. Generations of beings who had grown up in environments of systematic mistrust and emotional isolation had to slowly relearn the skills of authentic cooperation and emotional bonding. Children, who had never experienced unconditional love, had to be taught not just that such love was possible, but that it was safe to both give and receive it. But perhaps most importantly, these recovery efforts required the development of new forms of wisdom about the nature of consciousness and social organization. The beings working toward healing had to learn to recognize and counter the subtle psychological techniques that continued to operate even after their original implementers were gone. They had to develop cultural practices and educational approaches that could strengthen the psychological structures that make complex civilization possible while remaining vigilant against the forces that seek to dissolve them. The scenes shift to show you institutions that emerged from this work. Schools that taught not just technical knowledge, but emotional intelligence and social cooperation. Religious organizations that focused on rebuilding trust and community bonds, and political systems designed to be resilient against the kinds of manipulation that had proven so devastating in the past. More significantly, you observe the emergence of new forms of cultural memory. Traditions that preserved not just the historical facts about what had happened, but also the emotional and spiritual understanding necessary to recognize and prevent similar threats in the future. These traditions operated not through formal education or official doctrine, but through stories, rituals, and practices that were woven into the daily life of communities across the galaxy. What becomes clear as you witness these developments is that the galaxy's response to the threat represented by Malgus was not primarily military or political, but cultural and spiritual. The most effective resistance came not from armies or governments, but from the collective determination of conscious beings to preserve and protect the psychological and social structures that make meaningful existence possible. The vision expands to show you how these efforts gradually began to reverse some of the damage that had been inflicted on galactic civilization. Worlds that had been psychologically shattered, slowly rebuilt not just their physical infrastructure, but their capacity for trust, cooperation, and hope. Families learned to form genuine emotional bonds again. Communities rediscovered the skills of collective decision-making and mutual support. But this recovery was neither complete nor permanent. The mathematical principles that underlie the psychological techniques developed by Malgus remain valid, and the vulnerabilities they exploit continue to exist within all forms of complex consciousness. The galaxy's civilizations have learned to recognize and counter these threats, but doing so requires constant vigilance and deliberate effort from each new generation. She pauses, allowing the weight of this understanding to settle around you. Every generation must choose whether to preserve the psychological and social structures that make complex civilization possible, or to allow them to erode through neglect or deliberate attack. The techniques that Malgus developed will always be available to those who seek to exploit them. But so too will the wisdom and practices necessary to counter them. The holocron's light continues to fade, but its message has been delivered completely. You have witnessed not just the documentation of a historical threat, but a guide for understanding the ongoing responsibility that consciousness itself imposes upon those who possess it. The holocron's ancient light gradually dims to the softest whisper of illumination, its crystalline structure settling into the peaceful dormancy that marks the completion of its deepest revelations. The archive chamber around you seems to exhale with relief, as if the very stones have been holding their breath throughout your journey through the most dangerous secrets in galactic history. The oppressive weight of forbidden knowledge begins to lift, replaced by something more subtle but equally profound. The quiet wisdom that comes from understanding both the depths of darkness and the possibilities of light that exist within conscious existence. You find yourself standing in profound silence beside Vexus. The Sith historian's usually confident demeanor has softened into something approaching humility, as if the experience of guiding someone through these revelations has reminded her of her own small place in the vast tapestry of galactic history. When she finally speaks, her voice carries none of the clinical detachment that marked her earlier commentary, replaced instead by the thoughtful cadence of someone who has been forced to reconsider fundamental assumptions about the nature of existence itself. "We have traveled together through the complete chronicle of Darth Malgus," she says quietly, her words seeming to resonate in the chamber's ancient acoustics. From his earliest days as a troubled apprentice seeking to master his own emotional vulnerabilities, through his evolution into the galaxy's most sophisticated practitioner of psychological warfare, to his ultimate transformation into something that transcended individual existence entirely. But perhaps the most important understanding we have gained is that his story was never really about him alone. The holocron responds to her words with a final sequence of gentle projections, images that flow across the chamber walls like memories made visible. You see scenes of incredible beauty, sunrise over peaceful worlds where communities have learned to balance individual achievement with collective responsibility. Children playing in environments where trust and cooperation are natural rather than revolutionary. Beings from different species and cultures working together on projects that span generations. These are not utopian fantasies or impossible dreams, but real moments drawn from the lived experience of civilizations that have learned to protect themselves against the psychological dissolution that once threatened to consume the galaxy. They represent the quiet victories of conscious beings who chose to nurture the social and emotional structures that make meaningful existence possible, even when such choices required courage, sacrifice, and persistent effort across multiple generations. The legacy of Malgus's techniques continues to influence galactic civilization. Vexus continues. But so too does the legacy of those who recognized what was at stake and chose to act in defense of consciousness itself. Every world that has rebuilt trust after betrayal, every community that has learned to cooperate despite differences, every individual who has chosen connection over isolation, represents a victory against the forces he unleashed. The projections shift to show you scenes of remarkable ordinariness, families sharing meals together, friends offering comfort during difficult times, strangers extending kindness without expectation of reward. These simple moments of human connection might seem insignificant compared to the cosmic scope of the threats you have witnessed, but you now understand that they represent the most powerful form of resistance against psychological dissolution. The mathematical principles that govern consciousness and social organization work in both directions, she explains. Just as there are techniques that can systematically destroy trust and cooperation, there are also practices that can systematically strengthen them. The difference lies not in the complexity or sophistication of the methods employed, but in the intention behind their application. As the final projections fade, you realize that your journey through the archived memories has brought you full circle to a truth that was always present, but could only be fully understood after witnessing its alternatives. The psychological structures that make complex civilization possible are indeed fragile and vulnerable to attack, but they are also resilient and capable of renewal when tended with appropriate care and wisdom. The silence that follows is not empty but full, pregnant with the accumulated understanding of everything you have experienced together. You understand now why these records were sealed in the deepest vaults beneath Korriban, protected by defenses that could kill the unprepared. The knowledge they contain is indeed dangerous, but not because it reveals how to destroy civilizations. It is dangerous because it reveals the true responsibility that consciousness imposes upon those who possess it. Vexus approaches the now dormant holocron and places her scarred hands upon its crystalline surface with the reverence one might show a sleeping child. The story of Darth Malgus ends not with his ultimate triumph or defeat, but with the understanding that both outcomes were always possible, and that the choice between them remains active in every moment of conscious existence. His techniques will always be available to those who seek power through the exploitation of psychological vulnerabilities, but so too will the wisdom and practices necessary to counter them. The chamber begins to return to its normal state. The mystical energies that have sustained your journey through time and memory, gradually dissipating into the mundane reality of stone and shadow. But the transformation you have undergone cannot be so easily dismissed. You carry within yourself now not just knowledge of historical events, but understanding of the ongoing responsibility that conscious existence imposes upon all thinking beings. As you prepare to leave this sacred space and return to the wider galaxy, you understand that you take with you more than just another story from the vast archive of galactic history. You carry the wisdom that consciousness itself is both the greatest achievement and the greatest responsibility of sentient existence, requiring constant vigilance and deliberate nurturing to survive and flourish. The ancient chambers of Korriban settle back into their patient silence, and so the chronicle of Darth Malgus finds its peaceful conclusion not in the dramatic resolution of cosmic conflicts, but in the quiet understanding that the most important battles for the soul of galactic civilization are fought not on distant battlefields, but in the hearts and minds of conscious beings who choose, moment by moment, to preserve and protect the precious gift of meaningful existence for themselves and for generations yet to come. The story ends as all the greatest stories do, not with answers, but with the wisdom to ask better questions and the courage to continue seeking understanding in a galaxy where consciousness itself remains the most mysterious and precious phenomenon of all.